with Jennifer Hudson. Yeah, that's an upgrade for me. Well, this is really an exciting night for all of us, especially the Betty Gibson Lecture series. It's always very near and dear to me. This is the 26th year that we are able to do this, which is just phenomenal. It was started 26 years ago by Matt Gibson. We've got a great showing of Gibsons here tonight. So Sheila is Betty's daughter. Stephen Gibson is her son. Sharon Daniel is her daughter. We've got Phil Moss, Sheila's husband, and two grandchildren here tonight, Whit and Melissa. So glad to have you all. And her cousin, Brenda Nottingham. So we've got a great showing of the Gibsons, and we're just excited to have you all. And this is going to be a great program tonight as well. Jeff Fleming, who I think we all know, especially know as Mr. Kingsport, my son, retired in 2019 after a 35-year career in city government, rising from a planning intern to city manager. He's a passionate advocate for our community, especially the Move to Kingsport program, which he helped create in 1999, combat population decline and boost economic growth. Jeff has been recognized for his leadership, earning the Northeast Tennessee Hospitality Professional of the Year Award in 2022, the Lifetime Service Awards from the Kingsport Chamber, Visit Kingsport, Leadership Kingsport. His academic background includes a bachelor's degree in political science, engineering technology, and a master's in geography, urban planning from East Tennessee State University. He's an eternal optimist, history buff, and self-proclaimed data nerd, using his platform to inspire the next generation. Jeff and Christy married 38 years ago, have 2 adult children and 2 granddaughters whom they adore. His commitment to our community service extends to several volunteer boards, and he does Meals on Wheels. So we're really excited to have him in our program.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer Hudson. Okay. The thing about being in a small organization is you have to do your own technology, so hang on one second. All right, still got it. There you go. So I'll mention this a couple of times, but if you enjoy the short stories that you're going to hear tonight and want to follow along, you can go to kingsportspirit.com and you can follow along. You can sign up. You can just visit periodically if you want to, but you'll find much more content like this. Any little fun fact or tidbit that I find, I will share it there. And so please feel free to check that out. Of course, it's free and there's no charge. So obviously tonight we're here to honor Betty Gibson in the Memorial Lecture, and so I'm thrilled that Jennifer introduced the family. I really delved in a little bit into some of the family history and wrote an article that is the first article you will find on kingsportspirit.com if you go there right now, and it talks about probably the most famous person I was not aware of, and that's Rogan Showalter, who lost his life tragically back home after surviving World War I. Of course, at the time it was known as the Great War because we hadn't had a World War II yet. And he was one of the first to volunteer. He survived with shrapnel. And then he was hospitalized in Europe. He was one of the first Americans to go overseas to fight. And like I say, tragically lost his life. Betty was 4 years old when he died. And so as I was going through the newspaper and I was researching her life and finding out little tidbits, of course, back in those days, the society page reported everything. So apparently Betty excelled in kindergarten. And it went on to talk about the little girl birthday parties and who attended. And I was just reading it thinking, if I was a father reading and I was passed and I was reading about my little girl growing up, how proud I would have been. I couldn't help but think how proud he would have been of her and how she turned out, and her love for history and her early influence in establishing the Netherlands Inn Association and preserving that legacy. And that is carried on today through her family. And so we really, really appreciate that. Appreciate y'all sponsoring this. So as Jennifer said, my background is in city planning, and so I love to figure out how the relationship between the built environment and people, how that works out, why it happens, how it's planned, how it's laid out. So some of the questions that, I probably should have thought a long time ago when I was actually working for the city, but you don't have time to do that when you're working. I started thinking about, there's really a tale of two cities. There's the boatyard, which is the original Kingsport, and there is the model city, and they're about 100 years apart. So I wonder what the conditions were when the folks came in to start buying land and assembling property. What was here? What was left? I always heard the story that, Kingsport was the most important geographic location in Northeast Tennessee for years and years because it was the place where you could go and float your goods down the river in wet weather, at least, when the river was high enough. But then the railroad came along, and if you've heard me talk to civic clubs, you've heard me tell the story. The folks from Johnson City and Jonesboro and Bristol came over and said, hey, y'all have got a river, and we don't. If you'll support us building the railroad through our town, we'll support dredging the river for you all. And, of course, we know what happened with river traffic after that, and that was the last time we trusted anybody in Johnson City, Bristol, or Jonesboro. So literally there was nothing left of Kingsport after the Civil War. It just pretty much dried up and blew away. There weren't enough people left to even apply for their charter again. So while the city was incorporated in 1822, it lost its charter after the Civil War, and folks, lost families, they lost businesses, they went into distress with their properties, and many of them moved along to other areas. So that set the stage for these newcomers to come in and see what was available. So what were the development patterns prior to the model city? What were the original limits of the model city, and what neighborhoods sprung up just outside the city limits, some of which were later annexed? And what are some of the homes that preceded the model city? Now, obviously, I can't cover all the homes, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in the old Kingsport boatyard area, simply because it's been so well covered by Muriel Spoden, and I would encourage you to check those books out and see what all she's written about that. I use a lot of her materials, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the obvious houses, but I'm going to try to talk about some that may not be so obvious. Who founded modern Kingsport and what national trends influenced them? What were they thinking when they came south and they started putting property together? And then what does the evolution of neighborhoods look like from 1917 to 1959? So I'm going to be doing a follow-up from 1959 forward at the Kingsport Historical Society in spring, but we're going to stop for now in the mid-century 50s. So much of present Kingsport was outside the city limits. So if you look at the basic property that was acquired to build the town, it pretty much followed the ridge along Reedy Creek. It went over to what we know now as Eastman Road. It went south to the edge of the Holston River, and then it went over to about where Riverside Avenue and Fairview Avenue go up to Westview Park on the west. Anything outside that boundary was outside the original city limits. And if you could see it, I'm not sure you can, but right in here, it's a straight line from over in Indian Highland Park, just straight over to Gibson Mill. Anything north of that, including Jim Wright's house, Mayor Scholl's house, was outside the city limits. Fair Ridge Drive was outside the city, the original city at the time. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then when you look at the road network, you see Netherland Inn Road, which was the Lee Highway, the Knoxville Highway. Lynn Garden Drive was the Scott County Road. Bloomingdale Pike was the Reedy Creek Road. And Orbank and Warpath were aligned at the time. And I actually went back and triple checked that because in my mind, they don't line up. But even if you go to Google Maps right now and you took out Memorial Boulevard, they do align. You could just go right straight up Warpath Drive and kind of just bear and keep going up Orbank past Exchange Place. So that led to the river's edge, which was where Fort Robinson was, which later became Fort Patrick Henry. So that was the reason why there was a Warpath Drive leading to that location. Then, of course, you had the Horse Creek Road, which we know as Wilcox Drive or Solon Gardens Parkway or Eastman Road, that went out to the point southwest. So there are these maps called Sanborn maps, which are fire insurance maps, and they are a tremendous resource to be able to go back and reconstruct what happened. Because back in the day, that's all they had to reference, what a firefighter might come upon in the event of an emergency as to what's stored in the building, what exists there. And these are all over the country. So some of these I found even in the Library of Congress. So if you want to find other cities, like I did some exploring in downtown Knoxville, and it's pretty cool to go back and look at the areas that were where they had the horses and the livery stables and things like that are mentioned on those maps. So there were key sections in 1916: the pulp village and extract village, the manufacturing area of the tannery, the extract, the pulp area, cement, brick, and I started thinking, if I was building a city, what things do you need to build cities? Let's see, bricks, concrete. That's what you need to build. And so there was a real logic behind what they built to start the community. The Oak Street corridor, which to me, Oak Street is a much more tertiary street now. But back in those days, Oak Street was seen as a centerpiece for that particular neighborhood. And then the Five Points neighborhood extended all the way down from Market Street up to what we would call Watauga Circle or Ravine Road today. And then you had the radial streets. And then you had the area right at the brown on the bottom, right near Main Street, the 100 and 200 blocks of all the streets coming off of Main. So Pulp Village and Extract Village were new to me. And I was trying to figure out how to explain which is which. So extract was related to tanning leather, which was given to slipknot belting to make belts, and those belts were used to support all the manufacturing processes and machinery that was going on in Kingsport. So there were all these interlocking industries that were happening, but they didn't have any houses here. So if they built a plant, they had to have a place for the employees to live. So virtually every industry built their own, like workman's village to live in, a company town, if you will. And that's why they existed like that. So Pulp Village and Extract Village are Arch Street and Branch Street and Roller Street. Now, I couldn't tell you which is pulp and which is extract, but they were very clear to say that there was a difference. Carrying that forward to 1919, so just 3 years later, you see the map gets a lot more complicated, right? You've got the Watauga Street area has now separated from 5 Points. The Oak Street area has now picked up White City. And then you have Brickyard Row. Now, tomorrow there's going to be a great big ribbon cutting or groundbreaking for Brickyard development. And in 1919, there was already a Brickyard Row that was existing at the time. So we're really just kind of going back to the future, which I think is pretty cool. It's also Holston Heights had emerged by that time on Cement Hill. I remember going back to Google Maps at some point saying, I realize you have it labeled as Holston Heights, but I don't know anybody that references it as Holston Heights anymore. But Holston Heights was a big deal back in the day because that's where a lot of the social activities took place. There are lots of references of the Johnson City Orchestra coming over and performing at the club on top of Holston Heights, and the views of Bays Mountain that they mentioned. And none of us had ever really seen those views, at least not in my lifetime, until the Brickyard Park project got started. And now you can go over to the baseball fields and kind of get a view of what they were seeing, and you realize how beautiful that whole area actually is. By 1925, you see it's starting to get a little more complex with Sevier Terrace pops up, Jackson Heights, Gibson Town shows up for the first time, and the Dobbins Addition, which is the predecessor to Fair Acres. Borden Village shows up, and then you also see Corning is on there, and Eastman, and Edgewood Village and Beechwood Village. Edgewood Village and Beechwood Village were the company housing for Eastman, or some of the company housing for Eastman. So what were the development patterns prior to the model city? So if you kind of squint your eyes and pretend like the red roads don't exist right there, that's what it would have looked like at the beginning. So you had the Reedy Creek Road going to Bloomingdale. You had the Stage Road or going to Blountville in Bristol. And you had the Lee Highway going to Knoxville. You had the Scott County Road going to Gate City. And then you had the Horse Creek Road going to Greenville, Jonesboro, and Johnson City. And they all converged along Sullivan Street right in the middle of downtown Kingsport. So you notice that split going to Bristol and Johnson City is right there in the middle of town. Pay attention to that because I'm going to come back to it. So some of the aha moments I had is that when you look at the alignment of Memorial Boulevard as we know it today, and back in those days it came down what we know as Center Street. It didn't go down the 4-lane piece next to the mall. That didn't exist at the time. And then Warpath Drive was there, and it extended south toward the river. Look at the configuration of that blue compared to that red. It's pretty much like they just took that intersection and stretched it over a little further northeast. So So Memorial Boulevard would have been as significant as Stone Drive in those days in terms of traffic and commercial activity and so forth. John B. Dennis would have been comparable to Warpath Drive at the time, or vice versa. So you see how shifting that traffic can really change the development pattern of the city. The fork at Center Street and Sullivan Street, as we know it now, would have been the main split between the Bristol Highway and the Johnson City Highway at the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Federal Club or the Union Club in a minute that existed at the intersection of what we know today as Sullivan Street and Wilcox Drive. And you think, why would they build a hotel out there? Well, at that time, that was the main highway to Johnson City. So it was a major gateway into town. Now everything goes a different direction up toward Center Street. But that Y intersection pretty much got shifted over to the Fort Henry Drive Center Street split. So that intersection that we know today would have been as prominent back in the early stages of Kingsport as it is now. Another key moment, aha moment, is that the intersection of the Scott County Road, the Knoxville Highway, the Reedy Creek Road, and Sullivan Street would have been the most important node at that time. Well, that node now is I-26 at Stone Drive. It got shifted over. So you can kind of see how there was an area in the middle of town that got developed, and then over time it got expanded out to accommodate the growth of the city. The road to Johnson City was historically called the Horse Creek Pike, and sometimes it was called Horse Creek Road, the Horse Creek Pike. And it went out, and it didn't exactly follow Lincoln Street, but it almost did. And then it veered down what we would know as South Eastman Road and went on out into Sullivan Gardens toward Greenville and Jonesboro and Johnson City. It was changed to Eastman Road, the name, in 1953. And in 1914, a new bridge was built just a little further west, and they called that Long Island Drive, and it was changed to Wilcox Drive in 1953. So you can see as Eastman starts to grow and as the city needs more connectivity to the south, new roads were added and then names were changed to make it all make sense. So what neighborhoods sprung up just outside the city limits, some of which were later annexed? I had an old planning professor that used to tell me, pay attention to if the building is sitting on the street and looks like it belongs downtown, chances are that was a village that preceded the city. And so when you go down Center Street, just past the Indian Highland Park or Dobbins Bennett, you'll see a bunch of buildings that are right up on Center Street. Well, that was Highland Park. And Highland Park was outside the city at that time. Hillcrest, those buildings have just recently been demolished to make way for widening of Memorial Boulevard, but Deal's floor covering, that whole area that looked like a little downtown, that was sort of downtown Hillcrest. Litz Manor, Shelton Clark grew up in Litz Manor. I did a piece on kingsportspirit.com about Litz Manor, and it was interesting to find out how J. Fred Johnson was trying to figure out how to manage growth inside the city limits, but all these neighborhoods were springing up outside, and they weren't part of the city, but they needed services. And so J. Fred Johnson aligned with Mr. Litz to go to Bluntville and ask for them to step up and provide some services for Litz Manor children. And then a few years later, it was annexed, but they tried to help each other as neighbors. But Litz Manor grew up as its own freestanding community. It had its own school, and it was not part of the city of Kingsport. Of course, Colonial Heights is a much more recent example, but it has its own little business district. Long Island was just across the river, and as I think we all know, Long Island was a pretty lawless place because it was just outside the jurisdiction of the city, and of course, that's where Long Island tea was invented and many other things I understand. So, and then Sullivan Gardens, a little further out, but it also had its own little village node. Fort Robinson had its own little village node. If you go up Fort Robinson Drive today, right across from Fort Robinson Baptist Church, there's a group of buildings that looks like a little downtown Fort Robinson. And just down from there was actually the original Kingsport High School that was built by Sullivan County before the new city of Kingsport existed. So that was really the original Kingsport High School. And then Lynn Garden and Bloomingdale to the north, similarly, you see those little nodes. And those all grew up without, there weren't land use codes. There wasn't zoning in Sullivan County until I came to work here. So up until the 80s, there was no zoning in Sullivan County. And there were barely subdivision regulations. So when you go into Lynn Garden it looks kind of chaotic the way the roads are laid out, that's what happens if you don't try to manage your growth, and so that was one of the reasons why it was important to be inside the city limits. So what are some of the homes, the individual homes that existed in the model city? Obviously, Rotherwood. That didn't translate very well. Sorry, that font didn't work. Rotherwood was built in 1818 by Reverend Frederick Ross. I found it interesting that Edmund Pendleton, spelled Pendleton, I'm not sure if Edmund was his first name, but Pendleton had the land tract that was most of Kingsport along Reedy Creek. And it was granted by the governor of Virginia. Well, think about it for a minute. His land grant came from the governor of Virginia, but we were in North Carolina, but they didn't know at the time. So when they started trying to figure out which state was which, Pendleton kind of panicked, and he sent an agent to Raleigh to try to get his grant recognized, and it finally, after years, was recognized. And so then immediately, once it was recognized as being an official grant, he turned around and sold it all off to different people. And David Ross, Frederick Ross being his son, was one of the ones that bought it. So when you look at the Ross family, like, who are they? So Ross was from Central Virginia, and he was one of the biggest iron guys of the day. And I kept thinking, what is iron? What was so important about iron at the time? Because you hear that all the time. Well, iron, Great Britain had realized that they didn't have the natural resource of iron, which is what you use to make cannonballs and bullets. And so they were on an island and didn't have a resource, so they pretty much sent word over saying, anybody that can supply us with iron, we'll buy it. And so everybody went out trying to find iron in every direction. Of course, it was also used for other things like nails and things like that. But they had as much iron as they could produce, they could sell it to Great Britain. So Ross became a very wealthy person in Virginia, and he kept trying to expand his interests a little further south into what became Tennessee. Ironically, Ross had you can go look on Google even today, there is a house that he owned near Lynchburg called Mount Ida. And I'll tell you more in a minute, but the Sevier Mansion, as we know it on Sevier Terrace Drive, is called Mount Ida. So you wonder if that's how he got that. So Frederick Ross was the one that tried to really become an entrepreneur. He wanted to do the mulberry trees. He wanted to do silk, make silk and so forth. And there's lots of national publications about the quality of this product. And he almost made it, but he didn't make it. And so in the meantime, his overseer was Joshua Phipps. And so Frederick Ross ended up basically losing his property because he was so focused on silk production that Phipps stepped in and took over the property. And so Phipps owned the property forever, and he was described as being a very evil man, a very evil overseer. And so if you follow any of the Rotherwood ghost stories, he's the origin of that. He's the mean guy, is the Phipps. So in 1906, George L. Carter, who bought all the property for Kingsport, bought the property, and it was occupied by James Dobbins, which eventually became our first mayor, of course. In 1916, John B. Dennis bought the property and lived in it for a while. And if you can go find on kingsportspirit.com the story of Jill Ellis, and I love that story. She told it herself, and I just basically captured what she said and wrote it down. But Jill's family were the caretakers, the butler and the driver for Mr. Dennis at Rotherwood. And she was known as the little girl. He just called her little girl all the time. And he said, but she said he would come in and say, read, little girl, read. And she said, I just did anything he said, and I read, and I read, and I read. And she became so educated. And he would give her his pocket change over the summer before he would go back to New York, and she saved all that up. And so she had just talked about with such fondness everything that she heard about growing up in Rotherwood. But John B. Dennis ended up, when World War II broke out, Hunter Wright did a whole presentation on this. The Army basically came in and said, we don't really want to get involved in World War II. So the best thing that we can do is help the British stabilize Royal Defense Explosive, which is RDX. And RDX is the most powerful non-nuclear bomb that you can make, basically. And they needed a place to do that. And they said Eastman had all the chemical experience. So they said, Eastman, we want you to take one for the team. We want you to stabilize RDX for the British. So Eastman went to work to stabilize it. They did a pilot plant, and they proved that they could do it. They did a second pilot plant and produced even more. And then they said, okay, we need you to go full-scale production. And so they had to find thousands of acres and a place to do this. And John B. Dennis owned Rotherwood Farm now, which was 6,000 acres. And so he sold it to the Army with a reversionary clause. And so everything that used to be Rotherwood Farm became Holston Defense. And so listening to Hunter's presentation and all that Kingsport went through in World War II to try, for the good of the country, if you could roll back time and think, what if World War II hadn't happened? What would Rotherwood Farm look like today? Instead of a bomb factory, would it be houses? What would it be? And but Kingsport really sacrificed a lot for the good of the country. So John B. Dennis, as you can imagine, after the war, he got the property back, but how would you, he raised Jersey cattle. And so if you got the property back and you're looking in your backyard and it's all, an Army ammunition plant, he's like, he moved to Biltmore Village, and that's where he died, in Asheville. And his wife continued to live there till she passed away as well. So in 1945, John B. Dennis sold it to Herb Stone. It was sold at auction to Sam Pickering in 1980, and Roger Ball bought it in 1984. And Dr. Lanita Tebow has been there since 1991, and she spent 7 years meticulously redoing the property and renovating it. And so we owe her a great debt of gratitude for preserving a very legacy property. The Peach House, I added this slide because of relationship to Betty Gibson that we talked about. This is the house that you'll see if you walk on the Greenbelt, and it has been beautifully restored. I think John Scott, did 2 of the houses down there and lived in it for a while. It recently sold, I believe, to a family from Florida. But as I started trying to learn more about Betty, I realized that this is where the Showalters lived, and that the Showalters originally, I don't know what the great-grandfather or whatever, lived on Rotherwood Farm. And so when his son was born, they named him Charlie Phipps Showalter. Now, there's no evidence I can find that there was any blood relation to the Phipps that owned the property, but nevertheless, his name was Charlie Phipps, and CP was what he went by. So he went to work helping build the Clinchville Railroad, and the family story, which is in your handout if you have one, talks about how he would come down the railroad tracks, which was just right across Netherland Inn Road from the house, and he would blow the horn to let the family know he was okay. Well, they had 2 sons initially, twins. One survived, James Rogan Showalter, and Rogan is the one that volunteered for World War I and came back and was tragically killed. Rogan Showalter married Cleo Blankenbeckler, who's kin to Jitney Blankenbeckler, and their daughter, Betty Jo Showalter, married Mac Bo Gibson, and Betty Gibson is why we're here today. So now you know the rest of the story. So Sevier Terrace, this is Mount Ida. So if you are coming down Sullivan Street, at Lynn Garden Drive, and you're just barely off Lynn Garden Drive, there's a street called Mount Ida Place. And if you pause real quickly, not too long because you'll get rear-ended, but if you pause just real quickly and look straight up Mount Ida Place, it's lined up with the center of the Mount Ida mansion up there. So Mount Ida, the log house was built in 1790. Now think about it. When did it become a state? 1796. So this was before Tennessee was a state. For David Ross, who I mentioned, who ran a nearby iron furnace, his heirs sold the property to David D. Sevier and Annis Netherland in 1817, and the Seviers lived in that log house for a time until they built the comfortable brick house in 1884. So again, if Kingsport was incorporated in 1917, modern Kingsport, this was well before, and that was one of the main directions that Kingsport was growing. And I really apologize, this font didn't work out the way it was intended to. But if you look at Robert Sevier, so he was born in 1749 and he died at 1780 at Kings Mountain. So he was the brother of John Sevier, who later became the governor of Tennessee. He married Keziah Robertson, who was born in 1753 and died in 1806. She is the sister of James Robertson, who was the founder of Nashville. Okay, so if you have not seen it, I would encourage you to go see the Liberty play at Sycamore Shoals. I'm ashamed to say I saw it for the first time just a couple of years ago. It's well worth it, and it ties together all the names that were right here in this area that ended up becoming instrumental in founding of Tennessee. So Robert and Keziah's son, Valentine Sevier V, was born in 1780. Now, why is that circled? His dad died in 1780 at Kings Mountain, and he was born in 1780, so clearly she was pregnant before he left, so he never knew his father. He died in Greene County in 1854. He married Nancy Dinwiddie. They had David Dedrick Sevier, 1821 to 1890, who died in Kingsport. He married Annis Rutledge Netherland, 1825 to 1898. She's the daughter of Richard Netherland and Netherland Inn. They had a daughter named Nellie Sevier, who married Henry William Roller. If you've ever heard of Kingsport and you've heard of Roller, you know that Roller owned most of the property that was Kingsport, the Roller family in some way, shape, or form. And so the Sevier family married into the Roller family, and then they had two sons, William Roller Jr. and David Sevier Roller. A lot of times you would just see them as D&W Roller or DS Roller. They didn't really say Sevier, but his name was David Sevier Roller. But David Sevier Roller had no children. And William Roller Jr. had no biological children. He died in 1971, and David Sevier Roller died in 1959. So the property that became Kingsport ended up being purchased from, or much of the property from those two fellows. This property is on the corner of Clinchfield Street and Stone Drive. The address is technically 774 Bloomingdale Pike because Rita Gross Close threatened their lives if we didn't keep it that way. So we did. And it was, even if you go on Zillow, it says it was built in 1861, which I think is pretty cool that Zillow is up to date like that. The log house dates back to Captain Joseph Everett's purchase from the David Ross heirs. So again, David Ross had a lot of property down through there. Martin Roller bought the plantation from the Everett heirs in 1852, and 4 years later sold it to Joseph Gross Close Sr. for $4,000. In 1856, Gross Close began construction of the brick mansion. The Civil War interrupted the construction, and the long gallery two-story back L was not completed until 1886. So the house was inherited by M.C. Gross Close, who married Gladys Roller. There you go. Daughter of R. Pierce and Mary K. Hitsworth Roller. So there you go. The cabin built in 1819 and the house built in 1861. Right across from Holston Medical Group, of all places. 2320 Ridgefield, or Pendragon Road in Ridgefields. So a lot of y'all may remember this house. I don't remember it. Apparently it was standing when they built the clubhouse for the golf club. And the big white house, it showed up in the Times News in 1953 as being featured by the Tennessee Society of Preservation of Antiquities. And it was the home of Mr. and Mrs. C.P. Edwards, which of course is Valerie Yo's parents, right? I think. And that it was the epicenter of the Ridgefields farm. And so if you came across the ferry and went up to the top of the hill, that's where that house sat. That house was built in 1850 by none other than Martin Roller. Later, it was added to by his son, William Roller, upon his marriage to Miss Nellie Sevier. The present owners, Mr. and Mrs. Edwards, have made still further additions, among which are attractive stone terrace, which overlooks the Holston River. You can still see that eyebrow stone terrace on Google Earth if you go look at it to this day. So that's still there, but the house is no longer there. It was removed, as I understand it, for expansion of the golf clubhouse. This house is directly across from Great Body Company on Memorial Boulevard. This is built in 1840. So as you drive down Memorial Boulevard, you may not, it's hit and miss as to which houses look historic and which ones look very modern, but this house kind of stands out to me. It has recently been purchased and is being lovingly restored again by a local family. It's directly across the Great Body Company. It was the Enoch Shipley house. Think Shipley Ferry. So it was. They are buried in Dixon Shipley Cemetery on Montclair Road. Montclair Road is right there overlooking Fort Patrick Henry Dam. That's that cemetery that's in the circle on Montclair Road. So Shipley married Lucy Roller, a descendant of the Roller family who bought much of the original Pendleton Grant that is now Kingsport. The Rollers owned Roller Pettyjohn Mill off Fall Creek Road, and that is still in existence to this day. 1612 Watauga Street. So if you're driving down Watauga Street where Center Street and Watauga come together and you kind of glance over, Paulette Fox had a bed and breakfast there recently. And it's a beautiful home, and it doesn't seem to fit at that particular location. But it was built in 1900. So again, it was 17 years before the city was incorporated. And at that time, Center Street didn't go down the direction it goes. It came down Watauga Street. So that where you kind of have to have that funny little turn, it was on the main path. It wasn't off the beaten path at all. It was right there on the main road. And it was built by E.C. Barnes, which it happens to be the side street right there is Barnes Street. So you have Watauga Street and Barnes Street. So E.C. Barnes built the house. I found his name mentioned in Cantrell, Tennessee, which is located alongside old Sullivan County names like Gunnings, Shipley, Droke, Hamilton, Har, Vance, Anderson, and Boer. So I don't know much about E.C. Barnes, but I'd like to. So if any of y'all know about E.C. Barnes, I'd love to know more about it. Highland Park, these houses are directly across from the back of DB. I think one of those is Margaret Bay's house that she grew up in. And each of those were built in 1900. So again, if you're coming down the main road from Bristol to Kingsport, which would have been Center Street and Watauga Street at the time, these houses pre-existed the city by 17 years. Gibsontown and Nelsontown, so these two homes are still, these are recent examples. One is at 1010 Gibson Mill Road and one is at 1405 Rufus Road, built in 1900, again, 17 years before the city existed. But there has been a mill operating on that site since 1814, according to Muriel Spoden. So that is another area that's kind of surrounded by Stone Drive and Fair Acres and radial streets, but it really was its own freestanding little area that just kind of got grown around by the modern city of Kingsport. I thought it was interesting that in the 1905 Nashville banner, I found a reference to Gibson's Mill on Reedy Creek. You wouldn't think that it would be that significant, but it was even important enough to show up in the Nashville paper at the time. This is the Dobbins house in Fair Acres, as most of us know it as the Dobbins house. I believe the Wayne Case family owns it, and they are really using it just to store antiques and preserve the house. So no one's actually living in it at this point, but it was the centerpiece of the plantation that covered all of Fair Acres. So Andrew Martin was married to Elizabeth Bachman, who was the daughter of the plantation owner, and Martin built this house in 1878, so shortly after the Civil War. Their family cemetery is the one that's on Linville Street, the one in the middle of the road on Linville Street. Most of us know it now as the 20th century home of our first mayor, James Dobbins. So who were the people behind the plan and what national trends influenced them? What was going through their mind when they came to Kingsport? So Kingsport was developed by New York's elite. I found it fascinating to go and look at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from 1926 or 1915, and it mentioned Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt will arrive in Oyster Bay next week after a short visit with Mr. and Mrs. John Barker at Pass Christian, Mississippi. Mr. Barker is the bull moose leader of Louisiana. Among the members of the summer colony who have opened their homes it goes down and says William Nichols, Stuart Blackton, Albert Smith, et cetera, James Blair and Company that financed Kingsport. So James Blair and John B. Dennis. So he was a neighbor to President Roosevelt in Oyster Bay. So Nichols, it turns out, was instrumental in building the chemical supply business in the United States. That sounds kind of interesting to have a chemical plant here in Kingsport when your neighbor was in that business in New York. Ledyard was the personal counsel to J.P. Morgan, personal counsel to the original J.P. Morgan. Beekman, that name goes back to the founding of New Amsterdam. There's a Beekman Street down near Wall Street. Gurney Sr. built the largest tannery in the West, and he was the 14th mayor of Chicago. There's actually a town called Gurney, Illinois, and he retired back to New York. Ingalls owned the Homestead Hot Springs Resort in Virginia. So, and then Ingersoll invented the pocket watch. It was the first mass-produced pocket watch, including the Mickey Mouse watch. So all these folks were just neighbors in New York. So a lot of it, you wonder, back in those days, you couldn't just network virtually. You had to be kind of close to people that you could meet and interface and do business with. So they weren't just venture capitalists and investors in Kingsport alone. They also had national and global interests. For example, the Chicago L. So back in those days, if you had a street that was called a pike or even railroads, many of them were privately financed because the federal government and state governments hadn't got involved in road building. at that time. They saw them as private. So if it's a pike, they would collect money and they would use that money from the various people who would benefit from the road, and they would build the road, and they called it pike. So there's lots of pikes, and then if you see when the pikes stop, like there's a lot in Knoxville, but not so many in Nashville, that means that by the time they got to Nashville, the government finally got involved and they didn't build pikes anymore. So it's a good tip to tell you when that policy changed. So the transfer, this is the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1926, the transfer of the elevated lines to Blair and Company, who founded Kingsport, according to one who had an active part in the negotiation, is the first step in a consolidation of all the elevated roads here. The deal puts the Northwestern, Lake Street, and Union Loop elevated roads under one control, and it will be necessary to acquire the Metropolitan and the South Side elevated roads. A consolidation has been attempted before, but without successor. It has been a favorite scheme of Blair and Company, and it's now believed they're in a position to carry it through. And who was the ringleader? Look at the bottom center. John B. Dennis. So who was John B. Dennis? So in the Tennessean in 1910, it published I believe this was a syndicated piece that talked about who were the 7 future kings in the finance world. And those folks were J. Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, Henry Davison, Otto Kahn, Mortimer Schiff, John B. Dennis, George Baker Jr., and James Stillman Jr. So who are those guys? So Davison helped lay the foundation for the Federal Reserve. It talked about him going to St. Simon's Island and having a retreat with all these finance folks, and when it came out of it was what became the Federal Reserve. Kahn was best known as the partner in Kahn, Loeb and Company, who reorganized and consolidated all the railroads. Schiff, the family financed railroads, the Pennsylvania, the L&N, the B&O, and Westinghouse and Western Union, and helped govern the Union Pacific Railroad, Wells Fargo, and he was appointed to the original Federal Reserve Board. So, and then Stillman was the founder of Citibank. It was actually National City Bank at the time, but it became CITI Bank as we know it today. And he also married descendants of the Carnegie and Rockefeller families. And then Baker was the Dean of American Banking. He's the 3rd richest man in America behind Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller. So the fact that John B. Dennis was mentioned in that same breath as those folks should let us know how prominent he was. He didn't have any heirs. He didn't have any children. So I'd love to know whatever happened to all of his money, because it didn't end up in Kingsport, that's for sure. So they recruited respected national architects to build model neighborhoods for different classes. I'm just going to share real quickly that Nolan's general plan for Kingsport acknowledged the centrality of industrial production, citing 2 linear industrial districts near rail lines on the south, near the edges of town. He planned residential areas in proximity to workplaces. More expensive areas of single family occupied the hills above the downtown, and lower priced dwellings provided easy access to the manufacturing districts. As in all of his plans, Nolan reserved large green areas for parks. Just as Kistler, Nolan provided a hierarchical street network with wide boulevards in the central areas, and then narrowed down to curving streets and alleys in the housing areas. Nolan worked very closely with Clinton McKenzie. Remember that name. He worked with Clinton McKenzie for residential areas for different classes. Armstrong Village housed unskilled workers in group homes. The 50s in White City offered cottages for skilled workers in a Garden City setting. Remember that term too, Garden City setting. While Orchard Court was modeled on upper middle class suburbs such as Forest Hills Gardens in Brooklyn. McKenzie, who designed buildings that ranged from impressive Georgian residences for local notables to the Kingsport Inn, was one of the most prominent architects the Kingsport Improvement Corporation brought to Kingsport. Others included Grosvenor Atterbury, Thomas Hastings, and Electus D. Litchfield. That comes from the book Building the Working Man's Paradise. So we are in national publications explaining how Kingsport was laid out. So I said Garden City movement. So what is Garden City movement? So remember back in the day, in fact, if you go to Manhattan to this day, it's 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, A, B, C, D. It's all grid. Everything is grid. And they desperately wanted to get away from grid patterns and try to find a better way to build a city that was more palatable for living, not just for racing through on a straight street. And so Ebenezer Howard, who was actually British, came up with the idea of a central city and radiating streets outwards, where you'd have the tight commercial node in the middle, and then you'd have the hinterlands, if you will, on the outside. The garden cities would contain proportionate areas of residences, industry, and agriculture. He first posted the idea in 1898 as a way to capture the primary benefits of the country and the city while avoiding the disadvantages presented by both. So examples on the right would be Green Hills, Ohio, Greenbelt, Maryland, and Radford, New Jersey. And you can see those street patterns kind of look sort of familiar to Kingsport, don't they, when you look at those. So pro tip, look for the term green, garden, field, forest, fair in the neighborhood, i.e. Garden Drive, Forest Street, Green Fields, Green Acres, Garden Apartments, Fair Acres, Ridgefields, for example. All of those were built on the non-grid pattern. They were trying to have curvilinear streets, large yards, and green spaces so that folks can enjoy their property. So the Chicago World's Fair was in 1893, which is just a few short years before they really started conceiving the idea of Kingsport. So the planning of the Chicago Exposition was directed by Daniel Burnham, who was probably the most famous architect in American history, really, to be honest with you. His name is to architecture as Olmsted is to landscape architecture. So when you hear Burnham and you hear Olmsted, you know that that's truly American architecture. There were other types and styles, but America didn't really have one, so he was instrumental in helping come up with an idea for American style. And so he was very influential in like the National Mall in Washington, D.C., for example. So the Grand Exposition in Chicago displayed a model city. This is not my words, it's their words. Displayed a model city of grand scale known as the White City, marked with monumental symmetry and Gilded Age splendor, which marked the imaginations of American architects who were eager to formulate a new style of architecture unique to the American city. This desire ushered in a new aesthetic called the City Beautiful movement. So the Chicago World's Fair, you see the symmetry there with the long, it looks like the National Mall, right? Down below is the Kingsport Town Center plan. That was influenced heavily by that thought process. That is right across the street from where we're standing today. And if you could look out that mirror or window just beyond the fountain, there's a parking lot there, but there was supposed to be a connecting building that was supposed to be City Hall. And then the two flanking wings are now the library and it was the utilities company. Now it's a bank. But it was supposed to have that connecting piece that never happened. In the 60s, they decided to build the City Hall on Center Street instead of finishing the plan because they were concerned about parking. And so when this building became available after the bank left, it made a lot of sense to kind of go back and recapture the location that was intended, although obviously we'd all love the Kingsport Inn to still be here. But, you know, that symmetry was supposed to be these two blocks, and that didn't happen. So we didn't always carry through on the plans that they came up with. So again, who are these architects? Clinton McKenzie designed Shelby Row, Park Hill, which is the 50s. His estate is listed on Old Long Island's Gold Coast alongside names like Vanderbilt, Woolworth, Roosevelt, and Chrysler. He was an avid yachtsman, and he's famous for being part of the decision to deny the English team's protest against the American team, which was led by Vanderbilt. It was the closest that Britain ever came to winning the America's Cup. So do you see any similarities to the houses he designed in Long Island, the Kingsport? The Tudor-style house on the bottom? The house on the top is more of a Spanish style. We'll get to that in just a minute, but there's some influence of that in Kingsport as well. Kingsport Inn, which stood right where we are today, was a lovely hotel that was the same scale as what was happening across the street. So if you were standing on the front porch of the Kingsport Inn looking straight across the street, you would be looking down that brick path that leads past the fountain, and then the proposed Civic Center or City Hall would have been on the other side. That didn't happen. So you can begin to see the symmetry of what was intended to be here. So a lot of times I share this with high school students, so they don't have a clue about what I'm about to say, but why were courtyards so important? I'm probably the last generation that remembers a time before air conditioning, right? So I remember the Lincoln, you know, I went to Lincoln and we had the two courtyards and you could open the windows and every classroom had access to air from the outside to get a crosswind. And that was critically important at the time because you didn't have air conditioning. So the courtyards were a trademark of this design. This is what the inn looked like. This is an example of the courtyard. You see the upper rooms with the windows open, the rocking chairs in the area in the middle, and I look at that and think, gosh, what would I give to have that back, you know? But my whole career, people used to tell me that, you remember the Kingsport Inn? You remember when they did this? Oh, I can't believe they did that. And then eventually I found a copy of the last menu, and it was the year I was born. And I said, well, no wonder I don't remember it. You know, so I don't ever remember there being a building here other than this one. The block houses on Shelby Street were another example. So what they were facing at the time is they were in New York City. And what was happening at that time in New York City? Immigrants were flooding in from everywhere, and they were cramming into 4 or 5 story walk-up apartments that did not have windows. If you went down the hall in the middle, there were no windows, and they'd have 6, 10 people sleeping in. There was no regulations. There was no sanitation. There was no, they had collective bathrooms. They didn't have bathrooms for each residence, and it was overrun with people, and they were just cramming in any way they could, almost like they were sleeping on a ship. That's what prompted zoning. Early in 1916 is when the first zoning ordinance happened, because they were trying to combat those things. Now, I ran into that over here on Sullivan Street. Heath Gwynn's building that he renovated. I went upstairs, and you go down, there's 6 apartments upstairs. As you go down the hall and you turn into the middle apartments, there's a window, and I remember thinking, where's the window go? You're in the middle of the building. But there's a wet window well. So before air conditioning, you had to be able to open that window. You could step out into the little piece that was over the roof of the apartment downstairs, but it gave you access to air so that you could get some circulation and not just be being cooked to death basically in that middle bedroom. So that influenced them heavily. So they were trying to show, I can build worker housing that is decent and desirable, and it can meet all different kinds of needs. They were trying to use different styles. So they had attached homes like the Shelby Street row houses. They called it the block houses. This is actually in a book called Industrial Housing that was published in 1920 by Clinton McKenzie. So he was doing these model homes to show. The 50s, there are triplexes, there are freestanding homes, it's mixed use. In those days, mixed use, I mean, it's a common thing for us to have a mixed use zone today, but back in those days, it wasn't that common to have a mixed use zone like that. And so that was another example of single and semi-detached housing. Development number 3, as they called it, was the Forest and Myrtle Street area, Little White City. This is probably the neighborhood that we have done the least to preserve, that is really a part of the original plan. So Forest Street and Myrtle Street is filled with these neatly designed Clinton McKenzie homes. They've been altered over the years in many respects, but they were designed to be very attractive single-family homes for a modest income. And I remember Tommy Ultraman grew up in that neighborhood, and how do I know that? Because I was his paper boy. So this is what it looked like. You remember I told you about the Garden City and the City Beautiful movements. I didn't want grids. So that's why Forest Street has the triangle, and it has the little curvilinear streets. It's not just they could have done a straight street like many of the other streets, but they wanted to introduce some sort of interest in the way it was laid out. You can see at the top 802 Forest Street. That's what it looks like today with the blue metal roof and the gray paint. On the left is the rendering that Clinton McKenzie came up with in 1920. So every one of those houses is architecturally designed. It's a really neat neighborhood, and I think it's one that we just overlook many times. 3-story flats was another thing that he came up with, and this was up at the intersection of Broad Street and Ravine Road. Markham's Pharmacy just renovated part of the building, or they renovated all the building they controlled, but the plan was to build an entire block, but they only built one corner. So if you can see where the red circle is, that's all that got built. But what was supposed to be built was complete the courtyard the other way around, so they didn't able to do that. But the pictures on on your lower left are interior pictures, because there are now lofts on the second floor, and those are rented out. And the Markhams have done a fantastic job of renovating the building and renting out the lofts on the top floor. So again, I'm glad to see the reinvestment in these older buildings. Development number 4 was titled Negro Village. That's hard to say, it's hard to read, but that's what it was described in the book. And the whole idea, they didn't get it right, but they were trying to figure it out. Everything was separate but equal back then. So they were trying to build a separate but equal neighborhood. And it was what we know as Borden Village now. But Federal Street, the Circle, they had all the variety of housing, from the upper class housing to the entry level housing. They had churches, schools. Everything was designed to be a self-sustaining Negro village. The picture on the left, as you see at the top, is on Birch Street. If you look down below it, you'll notice the roof lines in those two houses. That's the design from Clinton McKenzie. So those houses on Birch Street are still existing to this day, but those were Clinton McKenzie designs, just to give you an idea. Now, what happened to that when they built the Borden plant? They decided they needed company housing for Borden, and so they didn't build it for the black community. They came back and said, no, Borden wants it for workers. So they didn't do it. So that's where Riverview came in eventually, but it was supposed to be in Borden Village. Broad Street development. Now, we've lost several of these homes. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner, that's an actual map along Broad Street. You notice the Dutch colonial sort of barn-looking building, and you notice in the upper picture, it's still there. That house is gone. You remember when Holston Valley was going through the buying up all the houses to build parking? That's where we lost quite a few of those Clinton McKenzie houses. So, but that's what it would have looked like back in, beforehand, before the hospital started expanding. Of course, at the time, they thought the idea for a hospital was to put it off the beaten path in a cul-de-sac, where you could convalesce with clean air, and then they needed an emergency room or something, and cul-de-sacs and emergency rooms weren't great combo, right? So they had to start trying to fix the hospital to fit the modern situation. This is on Watauga Street. The picture on the right is a recent picture. The picture on the left is from that 1920 book by Clinton McKenzie. So, they did add on a porch on the right, and they enclosed it. They also enclosed the porch on the left, but you see it pretty much looks the same as it did in 1920 when the building was built, although they have changed some of the clapboard siding. The Federal Club was located at the intersection of Sullivan Street and Wilcox Drive. It is now the Sullivan County Health Department and EMS. That building was demolished. There are tons of references over the years. It was the Union Club and the Borden Club and the Federal Club. It's where a lot of folks that came to town to work, they boarded there, they met their spouse there, they had networking dances and all kinds of things, but it just didn't survive. And so it's another one of those things that's been lost to history. And but wow, what if that building was still there? So who were the famous architects? Grosvenor Atterbury, White City is what he designed. He is known for his interest in standardized housing construction. He's noted for Forest Park Hills in Queens. I mentioned earlier Orchard Court was based off of Forest Park Hills. So if you look at the upper left, that's the area that looks like Orchard Court in Brooklyn. The lower right is an aerial view of that neighborhood. Does that look familiar? Looks like the radial street, doesn't it? Here in Kingsport, but that's in Brooklyn. Electus Litchfield, he was a devotee of municipal beautification and one of the main architects and town planners of a place called Yorkshire Village, which is now called Fairview. It's in Camden, New Jersey, right across from Philadelphia. It was built in World War I. The idea was a place of light rooms and clean yards with adequate playgrounds and amusement fields, a place of beauty and appropriateness and cleanliness so great that a man returning from his daily toil would receive new strength and recreation. A place where the man who could save a fraction of his income would be able to obtain with it for himself and for his children a share of play and education, literature and music, and other uplifting things. So again, look at that layout on the upper left. It looks a lot like Kingsport, all right? And the lower left looks a lot to me like Garden Apartments. Thomas Hastings, I think it was Chris McCart was in St. Augustine, sent me a picture, and I didn't know until he sent me that Thomas Hastings had done anything in Kingsport. I think he was really disappointed in me, but I didn't know that. So Thomas Hastings' most famous project was the New York Public Library. He also designed the Cannon Office Building for the U.S. House of Representatives and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. His firm also designed projects for the Flagler family, the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine, and the Hotel Alcazar, which is now the Leitner Museum, as well as residential projects for Guggenheim, DuPont, Harriman, and Vanderbilt. So he is the one that designed the Civic Center across the street, the library, the utilities, and the future Civic Center that didn't happen. So again, Thomas Hastings, one of the most famous architects in America. So what does the evolution of neighborhoods look like each decade in Kingsport's existence? Real quickly, home building follows road building. I think John Campbell told me that one time. And so there was a lot of discussion about how to transform muddy roads into paved roads that could support development. And that, believe me, was going on well up into the 1920s. So this article from the 1925 Times News said, with the exception of several stretches between Indian Springs and Bluntville, the new Lee Highway has been opened to traffic for its full length from Kingsport to Bristol. This road, 18 and 22 feet wide, smooth concrete, and a good grade, is one of the best thoroughfares in the entire country. It was 1925. We didn't have a paved road all the way to Bristol. So I remember them telling me that my office was in the improvement building, and there were 4 vaults. And so they had the vaults because you had to go to the courthouse in Bluntville, and there was no fireproof way to save things. So they had to save them in the vaults here because it took forever to get to Bluntville and back because of the road situation. And that's not exactly the case now, is it? So 1926, Times News, real estate in Kingsport is a good buy. You will make no mistake buying real estate in Kingsport. Kingsport's growth is now more rapid and more consistent than it's ever been. Well, until 1929. And so I often tell folks that, we live in a city that faced an immense uphill battle in its development. So 1917 was World War I, right? So then 1929, the stock market crashed. Well, that lasted for 10 years in the Great Depression. 1939, World War II started, and then 1941, U.S. entered the war. So the whole first half of Kingsport's existence was occurring during world conflict. And many of the things that we inherited as city folks is we couldn't use materials that were needed for the war for water lines. So you remember Old Faithful used to blow up block by block going down Market Streets because it was the wrong material to begin with, but you couldn't. The material that was required was needed for the war, so you had to take the backup material, and that was not intended to last as long as it did. So there's a lot going on. But if you ever think we have a problem, talk to the Oak Ridge city manager. He was telling us one time that they were going back and trying to forensically figure out where all the underground pipes and things went because the Army just built the town. They didn't worry about getting planning commission to approve it or anything. They just put it in and then said, okay, it's yours now. And there's stuff that goes under houses and under buildings and all kinds of things. So remember the Spanish style house I showed you earlier from New York? Here's an example, Grenada Court from 1925. And there's 5 or 6 houses right in a row just across from Lee School or Cora Cox Academy that meet that description. Again, this is from 1926, Brickyard Row. I found these houses shown on a map of when you went straight across Cherokee Street, and then it turned to the left, and there was a row of houses, and they called it Brickyard Row. And again, tomorrow there's going to be another announcement that there's going to be another version of Brickyard, and I'm pretty excited about that. Holston Heights went up to Cement Hill. This is from a 1914 Bristol paper. Now, again, 1917 was Kingsport, so this is before Kingsport existed. So 1914, they were talking about a Halloween party. On last Saturday evening, the Clinchfield Club in Holston Heights entertained a number of guests at their annual Halloween party. Music was furnished by the Johnson City Orchestra, and dancing was engaged in until late hour. So yeah. Radial streets, Center Street, West Sullivan Street, Catawba, and Watery. These are Sears home kits. So from 1908 to 1940, Sears entered the housing business. And you can go and find these online, and you can match them up all across America to houses that match that floor plan. So in the 1930s, during the Depression, they stopped doing this because folks couldn't pay their bills. So they finally stopped in 1940 providing Sears houses. But up until 1908 to 1930, and then the last 10 years being a decline, you could drive around any community in America and find these Sears kit houses. Because remember, back in those days, when you built a house, you were pretty much starting from scratch. This was pretty much a production-built house. It was pre-measured, pre-cut. It was sent on a box car. You unloaded it, took it to your site, and put it together. So it was a way to accommodate the rapidly growing population and keep up with housing. Borden Village and Lynn Garden, these are more Sears houses. I mean, you can look all over Borden Village and Lynn Garden and see these kinds of house styles, these small bungalows with a front porch. Westview Park, notice the dotted line there. So the dotted line at the top, which is basically Lake Street, was the city limits up until 1989, sorry. And Westview School, which you see sitting out here in the middle of the pasture, is now Theodore Roosevelt School. But that was a picture from 1938, what it looked like. So when you try to drive back and forth between Westview and Sevier Terrace, and you scratch your head because these houses are this old and these houses are that old, that's what it looked like when they started building Sevier Terrace. Again, back to these fire insurance maps. Notice that up here, can you see it at all? Gosh, it's very vague. So right in here, this red circle is New Street. And you notice there's a house sitting right in the middle of New Street because it didn't connect to Cherokee. Because Cherokee and all the streets to the east were intended to be residential streets. You can see there's houses lined up in a row down all those streets. Now, some of those houses still exist to this day, one of which used to be the Carriage House recently on Center Street. Eleanor Easton's old office, those were houses that were intended to be houses. So downtown Kingsport was supposed to end at Cherokee Street. From Cherokee over was supposed to be residential. When you start thinking about downtown today, it's a much larger footprint than was ever intended. Also, Mission Street, which kind of stubs out where Lee Apartments used to be, Sullivan Street over to Dale Street, it's labeled on this map as Watery Street because Watery Street was supposed to go all straight through and connect and up to the original Dobbins Bennett High School. Polk Village and Extract Village, these are houses that recently been renovated by the Phillips family. They did a fantastic job, but it's a great example of what 1920s architecture will look like in Kingsport. Edgewood and Beechwood, these the parking lot in front of the personnel area at Eastman off Lincoln Street is where Edgewood used to be, and then Beechwood was pretty much where the AEP power plant is located at the end of Sherwood Road. That general area is where Beechwood would have been. Both of those were housing to support Eastman. Part of Beechwood Village was also impacted by the John B. Dennis expansion. Borden Village, again, 100 new homes announced here by the Borden plant, and those homes were organized based on where you fit in the management order of Borden. So the bigger houses go to the higher paid folks and vice versa, but they all live together in a corporate village there. Sevier Terrace, thought this was interesting from 1927 Times News. The sale will be of special significance due to the fact that the lots are located on one of Kingsport's most desirable residential sections, which face the Lee Highway. Back in 1991, when I was doing 911 for the city, we had to make sure all the street names were correct. I can't tell you how many variations of West Sullivan Street, Lee Highway, and Knoxville Highway we still had on the records at that time, and never in my lifetime had I ever known anything in Kingsport to be called Lee Highway, but it sure was. And it went all the way from New Orleans up through Virginia. So again, I mentioned earlier that they were really struggling with how you deal with the race issue. And so there were many references to the colored section. And again, I say that's hard to say, it's hard to read in this day and time, but again, they were trying to figure it out. And so there was quite a bit of effort put toward making sure that there were equal opportunities. And so I noticed that, for example, on the lower left, it says colored section 1026 and 1019 Walnut Street. Well, Walnut Street is now Sevier Avenue. So if you look over to the right, that's that same house in 2023 that was built in 1933 or 35. They talked about Negro Scouting Program. They talked about working with the various pastors of all the black churches. And then they had, in the matinee section, they had references to even colored seating available. So again, while that's very unpalatable by today's standards, they were trying to figure it out. And I thought it was pretty neat. On the bottom right, it says, Mrs. J. Fred Johnson will be the chairman of Post 5, located in the colored section of Kingsport. Mrs. W.C. Pechtel, Mrs. Charles Gibson, and Mrs. R.L. Peters will be the white aides. Colored aides will be Ms. Ellen Howell, V.O. Dobbins, James Stafford, Louise Leach, Horace Sneed. Is that right? In the back of the room here. Mrs. Lee Walton, Mrs. Will Patton, Mrs. Cora Griffith, and Mrs. Helen Stafford and Virginia Phipps. So again, they were trying to figure out how to make that work. And I thought one of the advertisements I saw was talking about anybody could have a victory garden. If you were, the Kingsport Development Company would give you property to do a victory garden. And they made it very clear and put it in big, it doesn't matter, black or white. You all get one. And so I thought that was pretty neat, very progressive for the time. Glenwood Heights, again, this is out, remember Memorial Boulevard, Highway 126, which was originally Highway 11W. They offered new subdivisions for sale. Near Glenwood Church, we sold to the public by C.A. Harris. Now, where's Jane? There you go. So that's your family, right? So, yeah, Jane Harris. 100 lots, but only will be 50 will be offered for sale. And Glenwood Heights is owned by W.R. Jennings, S.C. Minnick, and T.R. Bandy. So that's Fort Robinson Realty, I believe, right? And then if you go to the west side of town now, of course, there's Jennings Drive and there's Minnick Trail that leads up to Tractor Supply. So that family was involved in real estate for a long time. The house on the top is a current condition. It was built in 1939, recently sold for $103,000. And then the house below is on the old Dixon School property. So Joe Begley bought that site and demolished the school that was beyond repair and is now retrofitted with many single-family homes that are one level. That one recently sold in 2022 for $399,900. So Litz Manor and Warpath. I mentioned earlier about J. Fred Johnson and his relationship with Mr. Litz. So in 1935, Warpath School burnt to the ground. The loss is estimated at $1,300, and it's the oldest county school. So Warpath Tribe was the oldest county school. So my question to myself was, which came first, Warpath or Conrock? And so Warpath was clearly the old name. I actually found references to a post office called Warpath, Tennessee, where the Bradleys that had Bradley Brothers Construction, one of the daughters had been corresponding with Chattanooga, and their children actually saw it from Colorado and all across the country, and they confirmed that was in fact the case, that Warpath was considered a town or a post office at the time. So when Warpath School burnt down, that's when J. Fred Johnson got involved and said, we've got to have a school out here. So the county built a new school called Litz Manor School. The Litz Manor School got built, but then in the 1950s, the city had grown to Green Acres and had built Andrew Johnson and annexed Litz Manor, and so there was no need for Litz Manor School anymore. So all those kids went to Andrew Johnson, and so Litz Manor School was torn down, and they built this subdivision that you see on the lower left. Those houses were built in 1960, but the rest of the houses in the neighborhood were built in 1940. That's why there's a 20-year difference, because the 1960s houses were built where the school used to be. So Lawndale and Wooddale and part of Bruce Street is where Litz Manor School used to be. So I thought that was a pretty cool story. A little Fair Acres. I love this. Drive out to Fair Acres, like it's way out. So Kingsport's newest and most beautiful residential district. So again, some of these are still Sears home kits. So if you look at the bottom right, then you look to the left is an existing house in Fair Acres, and the model is on the right from Sears home kits. So there's a wide variety of architectural styles throughout the Fair Acres area. Bellevue, also on East Center Street, indications pointed today to Kingsport's huge construction program being carried well into the year 1938, as an announcement was made that property located at the east of Highland Park on Highway 11W has been divided into home sites. Owners of the Bellevue addition, comprising about 65 acres on the north side of the highway, said yesterday the property had been subdivided into 226 lots, facing 9 streets, including in the development, each street 50 feet wide. And these 2 homes that are shown are recent examples of homes that just sold in the Bellevue area. I remember Shirley Britt. Anybody know Shirley Britt? So, I didn't put a fine distinction on where Highland Park and Bellevue and all these subtleties to me. And like I call Bloomingdale everything from Stone Drive out to Arcadia is Bloomingdale to me. But no, don't have that conversation with someone from Bloomingdale. They'll quickly explain where Cedar Grove starts and stops, and where Kingsley starts and stops, and all this kind of stuff. So, but Shirley would fight you. She lived in Bellevue. She did not live in Highland, and she didn't live in Dixon Addition or any place else. She lived in Bellevue, and so I always remember that. Oak Grove was just across the street from the intersection of Memorial Boulevard and Center Street as we know it today. It centered around Miller Street, and I noticed down the lower left-hand side that the developer was Henry Miller. So I guess that he named it after himself. And if you look at the bottom left, those are two houses, one built in 1938, actually both built in 1938, and one recently sold for $229,600, and the other one sold for $144,000. And you see how it's been renovated, the one in the lower middle. So I really love to see these old neighborhoods being shown some love and renovated. Ridgeway was just to the east of Oak Grove, and I believe, isn't this where the Ford sisters grew up, maybe? Ashley Street and Ridgeway. So this is Ashley and Ridgeway, and it's called Ridgeway Addition. And so the two houses on the bottom center are an example of what you might find in that area. Built in 1938 and 1940. One just recently sold for $210,000, and the other one sold for $153,000. If you look at those gleaming hardwood floors in the middle, you just can't get that kind of craftsmanship anymore. Riverview. So I remember I said that Borden Village was supposed to be the black community, and so they came back and decided to build Riverview on the other side of the tracks, which is pretty tacky, but they did. And they were doing the defense homes, which is the homes along Carolina Avenue, Pinola, the speed brick homes. And so they did similar homes in Riverview. So if you pay close attention, you can pick those out in the Riverview neighborhood to this day. And they named they did the public housing. Robert E. Lee Homes was for the white community, and Riverview was for the black community. Again, that stuff is hard to say, but it is a part of our history that if we don't remember it, we're doomed to repeat it. Fort Robinson was west of what is now I-26. 1942 is when the Fort Robinson Addition took place. Moore and Walker. We were just talking about that, Sharon, weren't we? I'm Fuller and Hillman, and I've eaten Moore and Walker, yeah. So there's two houses as an example that are in Fort Robinson Addition right now. One just sold for $195,000 that was built in 1961, and then we've had some new additions that have been built. This was built in 2020 on Union Street, and just sold for $235,000. So Oakwood Forest was the Kingsport firm was incorporated, called Oakwood Forest Incorporated. It was the incorporators were Glenn Bruce, Alan Dryden, and E.G. Hunter. That's why I was asking Jennifer earlier if her hunters connect back here, and they don't. But they formed a corporation to build this neighborhood. And as an example, we've got a couple of the homes that just sold recently. One was built in 1950 that just sold for $305,000. And the one down below is on Oakwood Street that just sold for $265,000, built in 1948. But that's over right behind what used to be Oakwood Forest Christian Church. I think they changed the name just recently. So Bay's View of the speed bricks, the defense homes, they were trying to figure out how to house all the veterans that were returning from war. So they were trying to build these brick homes as quickly as possible. There was a plan that Bulova was involved with from New York that was going to invest in what's called Winston Terrace, and it was going to be the South's largest development. And they only got the 1,600 blocks of Sevier, Pinola, and Carolina built before the war broke out. And so if you notice a distinct difference in the 1,600 blocks of those streets I just named versus the 1,500 and 1,400 blocks. They've eventually just sold all the remaining lots to the Kingsport Defense Homes, and they built the speed bricks where Winston Terrace was going to be. So, some of those houses on the 1,600 block of Pinola they're 2-story or 1.5-story. They're wood frame. It's a different architectural style. And so when you try to figure out, well, where in the world is Bay's View, look at those blue dots. It's all over around Lincoln School. It's around the Garden Apartments, and then it goes out Carolina, Pinola, and Sevier Avenues. Westwood Hills, this is also an extension of Ashley Street off of Fort Henry Drive. Westwood Hills on the Johnson City Highway, 5-bedroom or 5-room frame houses complete with built-in hardwood oak floors for $5,850. Boy, wouldn't that be nice these days, right? So here's a couple of examples that just sold. One sold for $226,350, built in 1950, and another one in 1947 that just sold for $154. But again, still a very desirable neighborhood and still people reinvesting in that community. Forest Hills out in Colonial Heights. Now the Fort Patrick Henry Lake was just getting started in the early 1950s, so you're starting to see housing go out there. And this is along Colonial Heights Road. This house was built in 1953, a ranch-style home, which was with a carport, which is a major thing at the time. That one just sold for $222,000. And look at the interior, how beautiful that looks. Ridgefields, this comes from the Library of Congress, which I thought was pretty cool to find Kingsport and Ridgefields mentioned in the Library of Congress. So these were the Olmsted Associates. Remember I mentioned earlier that Olmsted and Burnham were the most famous architect and landscape architect names. So Olmsted was hired to lay out Ridgefields. And the way you got to Ridgefields at that time was the ferry. So the centerpiece was Pendragon. It was much later that they built the bridge where Ridgefields Road is. And so if it seems kind of odd that all of the civic, stuff like the country club and the golf course and all that is on a dead end, it wasn't always on a dead end. It was at the main entrance at one point. And if you look at that layout that you see on the lower left and you put it over a current layout of Ridgefields, it is pretty close. There's a few streets that didn't get built, but most of it's pretty close to what actually got built. And so when I take folks from out of town and they see Ridgefields to this day and they can walk out on the back porch and see the golf course and the mountain in the background, they can't believe that that is a possibility, in our area, that's so well designed. But that's what the value of good design does for you. It carries on forever. The Oaks from Acorn saying has been proved once again. From an idea in the minds of a few forward-looking people has grown a new residential subdivision which Kingsport views with pride. I'm speaking of Ridgefields. Of course, where the first new homes are now nearing completion. City water is available, and the subdivision has been approved for FHA home financing, and more new roads are about to be added. The country club and swimming pool will be in operation this summer, and long-range plans include complete shopping center. And ask Bennett and Edwards about your Ridgefield home site. So Ridgefields wasn't in the city until the 1960s. So for a long time it was outside the city, but it had the sprawling. You look at these and they're deceiving from the front because it looks like they're one-story homes, but from the back is where they put the golf course. So you get the two-story and the beautiful view, and it really is. It's very deceiving. And those houses, of course, to this day are going for $560 to $396. And these prices are a few years old. I mean, now it's gotten even more inflated, I guess. Dornick Court was built along Warpath Drive, and we're seeing a lot of reinvestment in that area. So this would have been in the 1950s, early 1950s. These ranch-style homes, here's an example on the lower left, just sold for $246,420. One of the houses on Warpath Drive, and another one right beside it sold for $244,500. Both built in 1954. So again, you're seeing, if you haven't been in the housing market like I haven't been looking for a house in a while, it may surprise you at what houses are going for and what is going on inside in terms of remodeling and modernization. Lake Crest, 1958 and 59 was added. That's right there behind Ingalls, going toward the Mead Cabins. Those houses are selling recently for $120,000 to $234,000. Patrick Henry Heights was located right there on Walton Circle near Warriors Path. Again, everything was going toward the lake. And if you look at that bottom right, look at that knotty pine. That was all the rage back then, and I think a lot of people painted it, but luckily these folks didn't. They appreciated the craftsmanship. Hemlock Park happened in 1954 and 55. They're selling for the mid-600s at this point. And then Midfields to the northwest, I love that retro font on the upper left-hand corner that appeared in the newspaper in 1955, and you could get a house for $9,350 back in those days. But even Midfields up in the northwest corner, these two pictures are the same house, but it was built in 1963, and you see how it's been modernized and updated and sold for $364,900. Then Patton Heights was built in the 50s and 60s, but that would be the area along Afton Street and to the west, and you see more of the, I call Brady Bunch homes, the tri-levels, selling recently for $310,000 and $179,000. Green Acres, 1958. I thought this was interesting when you look at the upper left-hand corner. Follow this how to get there map to the Medallion home. Light conditioning is recommended by the American Home Lighting Association. Adequate wiring for full house power. Comfort conditioning with all electric heat pump. Full quote of time and work let's see, work-saving electrical appliances. So they were just introducing electricity into houses at that time, and so that was a big deal, and it's something we take advantage or take for granted now, but was happening there in the early 50s. Sevier Terrace, those houses also early 50s. The house on the bottom is on Putnam Street, just off of Morrison Avenue, and look how they have thoughtfully renovated that house and what they've done with it, and sold for $260 recently. So what I'm doing now is the Move to Kingsport program, and I get to share these stories with folks that are considering moving here. It kind of keeps me busy, keeps me out from underfoot and out from bothering the city manager. But we have recently been named as a Wall Street Journal #7 top emerging market in the winter of 2023. Okay, so why is that? Because the Wall Street Journal says that people are looking for smaller markets, healthy economies, and easy commutes. They're looking for an affordable refuge from high costs. And while some of those numbers may sound high to us, if you're from outside the area, they're very low prices compared to what they're accustomed to. And so we're starting to see much more of an influx. And so we've seen more than 2,000 people move here in the past couple of years from out of state, from all 50 states. The housing market, also, this is GoBankingRates.com. These 15 cities are poised for the most stable growth and are likely to keep their value. And you see Knoxville, Kingsport, and Johnson City mentioned among those other cities nationwide. So again, these are things that we can't control, but national interest is starting to realize what we've got going on here, and it's a pretty special place. So I'll end it there, and I would just encourage you, if you're interested in more stories, to follow me at kingsportspirit.com. I'm happy to take any questions if we still have time, or I'm going to hang around afterwards if you'd like to talk more privately. Any questions? Thank you. Yeah, I'll try.
They had no children.
Right.
Okay, around the year 2000, my wife and I were over there putting flowers on my mother's grave.
Yep.
That was a gray, Crown Victoria, black vinyl top, driven by a chauffeur.
Uh-huh. Wow.
He gets out, it pulls up to John B. Dennis's grave. He gets out and unlocks the finish. He goes back and opens the back door, and a frail older lady gets out. She had a veil on. He escorts her over. She goes in the tomb, and he stands beside the door for about 10 minutes. And then she came out, and he locked it back, and they drove off.
Interesting.
I've often wondered, who could that have been?
Yeah, I don't know. I know when they did the refurbishment of the grave, they had a hard time finding a relative, but they did find a distant, like niece up in the Northeast that was able to come and be there present, or somebody related maybe. Any more questions?
They had the keys.
Yeah, they had the keys. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Appreciate you. Okay. Thank you. Hey.
My parents' house, my father built a house in Richfield in 1959 using the old Kingsport brick.
Yes. Well, Henderson?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Bill Henderson.
Yeah, that's the house I saw.
I met you before.
Yeah.
And
well,
you used to kind of know him a little.
Well, he was on the planning commission. Yeah. So let me turn this microphone off. Hey, the Chef Jervis was the real